Greetings, everybody. I'm Daniel Foor, and it's Monday, January 4th, I think, and I'm going to be sharing a bit about ritual and the ancestors and grief today. And I'll talk for maybe a half an hour, and then we'll have time for questions if folks have questions, and yeah, take it from there. It's also okay to type your questions as we're going. By way of opening, it's important to give some kind of acknowledgement, and in that spirit I acknowledge the ancestors that back me, and acknowledge the good earth here in what's now western North Carolina, the other Irumale, the Orisha, the deities that I honor in my own practice, and the other benevolent forces that back me and those listening, help there to be a gentle and effective container for this sharing and discussion today. We gather and talk about you, but also acknowledge you and your reality and your presence. Thanks. So, to situate myself first, as I said, my name is Daniel. I live in western North Carolina, which is traditional Cherokee, Tsalagi lands, and my own ancestors of blood are early English, German, a little bit Irish settler-colonialists in North America, by way of mostly Pennsylvania and Ohio. And I live here now with my family. And I wasn't raised with any kind of framework for ritual or honoring the dead or anything like that, but I sought it out as a teenager, really, and had the good fortune to connect with some teachers in that way, and then have gone on over the last 25 years, I'm in my early 40s now, to eventually be useful and able to support others along their path with relearning ritual and things like that. And I've also gravitated toward what I describe, it's not unique to me, but it's the language that resonates with me, as an animist, or you could say earth-honoring, relational approach to spirituality, which recognizes us human folks as just one person, one voice, one constituent in a much wider field of kinship that includes the land, the human ancestors, the mountains, the rivers, the deities, the plants and animals, etc., etc. So that's the ethical orientation that I'm working from, this animist one. Within that, I have a specialization. I work with the human dead. I also happen to be a doctor of psychology and a therapist and an initiate in West African Orisha practice and the lineage of Oluwafalu Adesanya Woyade from Oderemo in Ogun State. But what I'm sharing about here isn't focused on Yoruba ways per se, or any of the technical stuff about animism. I want to talk about the dead. I want to talk about grief and about what it is to be in a global pandemic as well. So the ancestors are kind of trendy now for folks who weren't already thinking about them, and that's not a bad thing insofar as it is an encouragement for folks who weren't previously consciously connected to get a bit more connected and to get a little more culturally situated so that our efforts for cultural healing might be a little more effective. And so it means, though, when we come back into relationship with the dead, that we want to wonder, are we understanding it in the way that intact lineages or traditionalists have been understanding it? Is there any way in which we're unconsciously importing some assumptions that don't actually serve us well in that terrain of direct reconnection with the spirits of the ancestors? And what I've noticed, and some things I've had to unlearn and continue to unlearn over time, is that an assumption that the ancestors are the recent dead, the ones we remember, our deceased grandparents or even children or parents or friends or whoever it might be. The black and white photos, if you have any. That's not inaccurate, but it's very incomplete. The dead also include many, many, many generations before remembered names, whose specifics you're never going to learn about, but in spirit as a big collective force are available in the present. They include the opportunity, the possibility of relating with those among the dead who you're not connected to by blood, although focusing on ancestors of blood and body tends to be where I encourage people to begin. And we tend to assume that the dead are individuals as well. not only recent ones, but individuals. Also, it's not false, but the dead often can be related with as lineages, as groups, as collectives or associations in spirit. So it's not just one person. It's not just your grandma. It might be your grandma, but it might be that she's the face of a lineage of grandmothers before her. Or it might be some bigger collective force that doesn't even present in a human way, but is, in its essence, essentially ancestral consciousness. So the dead can be big collective energies, not just individuals. And another is the assumption that the dead dwell in the past. It's not like that. Yeah, we can say the ancestors are all the ones that were previously incarnate in human form. I'm talking about the human ancestors. We could expand it even more widely, and that's fine, but that's not quite how I'm using it as a term right now. But when we say it's the ones who are previously incarnate, we're relating with them in spirit now in the present. They dwell in the present. The ones who are returning and taking birth again are the ancestors returning. So think of them as our mirror, our shadow, our the other half of the city of human form on the other side of the river, that they're not in the past. That's important. Even though they may have lived in the past, that we relate with them in the present. So it also means that they change. A final thing I'll say just in a general way is that in supporting folks over the last 15, almost 20 years, to come back into relationship with their own ancestors of blood and just more generally with the human dead, I see it as very, very normal and very ordinary and very, not just doable, but normal. It doesn't have to be framed as spiritual. You don't need a special proclivity to talk to the dead people. You don't need to be a medium. I don't see dead people, fortunately. Some people do. I'm glad I don't have that, really. If I close my eyes and focus on it, I suppose I could see some, but it doesn't have to be a big identity thing. It's a very normal thing and useful for people of whatever background to come back into relationship with their ancestors. There's a lot I could say in a general way, but I want to speak here because I want to make space for questions about two more specific things. One is about the pandemic that's kicking the collective ass of the world right now, and the other is the grief and sorrow and how it relates with this whole terrain. So, I'm in the United States, like the UK, like Spain, Italy, Peru, some other places, the percentage of people dying here is quite high. And is it that because of terrible mismanagement, entrenched furthering of racist discriminatory policies, and there's all kinds of reasons we could say that that's happening. And even in places that are fairly well managed, it's a tough situation with the pandemic. So there's a lot of people dying that weren't dying in this way a year ago. And when there's increased crisis and death, because even if you're not dying today, your life's been altered, your life rhythms have been altered. That's definitely true for us with the pandemic, parenting and living in this like terrarium of a house day after day after day. And for everybody with kids, my God, like compassion, it's a thing. And when death and crisis comes into our life, it tends to have both a scattering and a focusing effect, at least from what I've noticed. The scattering is the way in which when there's trauma, there's activation, your nervous system is stirred, it's hard to focus. It's hard to just, you had this real spiritual connected thing going on, and then suddenly your life is upside down. You're stressed about money, and somebody you love just died, and now you can't focus. So that's real, and a lot of people are sitting with that. I sit with that some days. And then the other side of that is the increased focus, which is like, hey, you're going to die. We're going to die soon. We don't know when. It might not be, in the next decade, but it could be this week. And what are you going to do about that? Are you ready for that? Are you ready to answer to your people about how you spent your life? Maybe you'd actually be excited to head there because the world is really dense. I know a lot of people that are like, yes, sign me up. I get to die today. But a lot of other people are like, whoa, I'm not ready for that. And so it's not a bad thing to lean into that focusing aspect of crisis and death and seek to intentionally clarify our destiny and what we're doing here. And our ancestors are a good place to go for that. And again, when I say our ancestors, I don't mean your grandma necessarily. It's possible you had a super wise, spiritually connected grandma, in which case, that's fortunate. Good for you. But I mean, as a collective body of wisdom, the ancestors, including at least the ones from the last 1,000 years, before remembered names, the deeply wise and awake and kind ones, even when they were on earth, let alone all the evolution and maturation of the soul that's happened after their death. So those really big collective wise energies that are part of your specific blood and body lineages, those ones, that collective, that's not a bad place to seek about clarity about what you're specifically doing here. It's a good place because they're stuck with us. I mean, vice versa, but they're invested in us because we're one aspect, at least, of their continuation here in this dimension. And often our people have made a lot of sacrifices so that we could have the chance at flowering during this life. So they care. And another reason that they're good to approach about the topic of focus and destiny and making sure we're doing what we're here to do is that often our lives are a continuation of their unfinished work. And people don't always want to hear that, because there's a tendency, at least in the United States, to be like, no, my life is definitely my own, and ain't nobody's business but mine. I got my very special, unique, individual, compartmentalized, singular life. Yeah, well, it doesn't seem like it's actually set up that way. What we register as personal, in my view at least, not always, but often is a continuation of some element of what we are, the part of us that is part of this bigger ancestral network or mycelial web or network that's saying, we still need to sort some stuff out here. So here's the ledger of unpaid debts. Here's the projects that were started but not finished. And good luck reckoning with that. Maybe you move it along a little bit. So we can have that influence of unacknowledged blessings and unfinished, like burdens or debts, be conscious or unconscious from our ancestors. An advantage to getting, getting to know them directly is that we can bring those influences more conscious. And in doing that, we sharpen, we hone our focus a bit in this life, which is precious and brief. And in a time when things are up in the air and it's easy to stay in the spinner of crisis and turbulence, in some ways it's an especially good time to hone your understanding of where you need to be specifically. Because if you're in somebody else's lane of destiny, you're going to get knocked around. Like doing our own life is hard enough. You try to live somebody else's life, you don't have the backing of the spirits in the same way, and it just gets harder. Yeah. I see some good questions coming in. I'm going to get to those in just a couple minutes. There's just a couple other things I want to convey, but it's fine to keep those coming. Things will shift in some way eventually. I think there'll eventually be an opening up. I don't know if it'll be in 2021. If it does happen, that enough people get vaccinated and there's something like, I don't say normal, but the way it used to be, rhythms a little bit, then it will be a time where it makes especially good sense to know how to spend your precious life energy, if you're not already clear about it. So Use the quiet time to get to know your people more deeply. We'll be with them soon enough anyways. And the third of three things I want to convey, and we'll see what questions there are, is that grief has a lot to do with ritual relating with the dead. Not always. The ancestors are a lot of things, and they're not only associated with death, any more than living folks here are only associated with birth. The death of the body is just the rite of passage to join the ancestors. And so in that way, they're not so death-focused per se, but the loss and change associated with people going home that we love, that we miss, that cause us to feel a bit more lonely here. There's a lot of people going home right now. There's a lot of people dying without involved grieving and human connection in the same way. And so it's more death compounded by less effective grieving rituals and less effective care for one another. And so there's a lot of sorrow in the collective field right now. And that grieving well is one of the ways that the dead become ancestors. The dead actually get out of the gravitational field of this dimension and make it to the realm of the ancestors. That the dead genuinely transition and don't just hang out in a ghosty, heavy, stuck state. Because just being dead doesn't make you wise and kind. It just makes you not in a body anymore. There's a kind of process that needs to happen. It can look a lot of ways, but something needs to happen when you die. And being grieved well by those who are still here is one of the factors that can really support that change. And we already, I'm going to say we, generalizing about the United States, generalizing a little bit about American white people culture, because the United States is a lot of things. I'm going to speak just from where I'm sitting. And we don't do grief very well. But there's a lot of stuck emotion. That's true for guys, at least. That's a mass conditioning I received. And it's true for just a lot of people. If you haven't dug in and relocated your heart, or if you're not someone who already felt, pretty in touch to begin with. And so it means that we're at a real risk of getting flooded with the increased loss and sorrow and isolation on top of a hard to grieve well already. We're already dealing with a cultural backlog. It's one of the reasons people are so terrible to one another and so mean-spirited so often, because people end up feeling really sad. And rather than being able to say, man, I am just so sad right now, it's more like, I'm hurting, and fuck you. I'm going to make you hurt. And so I want you to hurt like I hurt, because that's the intimate move that I know how to do. It's way too vulnerable to be like, I'm in pain. You hurt me. Let's talk about it. And so there's often this, let me share that experience with you by hurting you. And so we do that. And then when we do it, we create fresh damage. And I would say we do dishonor to our people in that way. Because they're like, oh, don't do that. It's already rough enough. And so one of the ways out of that cycle is to learn to grieve well. And what the application of it in the terrain of ancestral healing ritual is that sorrow, the blocked sorrow and grief, and the ungrieved grief of our lineages is part of how the dead become well. It's part of how the stuck, ghosty, heavy, hazardous energies that are not always, but sometimes a part of our lineage, especially when no one's been taking care of it ritually, it's how they get transformed and metabolized. That's not the only way, but it's an important way. And it's also how we stay current with all the loss right now. Because there's the pandemic, and then, oh, by the way, there's the ecological catastrophe that's unfolding. And there's the centuries of tenacious and hard, seemingly hard to fully transform, like racial injustice, injustice around gender, around inequality in class and resources and occupation of land, and all these like human ways in which we're hard with each other. These are ancestral debts. They're harms that were set in motion and became institutionalized and systematized. And now we're grappling, we're down lineage from this legacy of just hazardous behavior and trying to sort it out, and often feeling flooded and overwhelmed by it. And there's sorrow as well. And if we can't feel it, then we'll end up at a place where I see a lot of people already, which is, I'm also a background psychotherapist, and when people have whether it's an official diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, when people have what I would describe as trauma, not always, but often enough, one of the ways that presents is an inability to grieve. It's like it's hard to cry, it's hard to touch strong emotion, because to touch it a little bit means to just be flooded and to feel totally out of control. And so culturally, we're kind of in that already. It's a tough cycle to get out of. We can, but I think one of the ways we get out of it is we sit down with our people. Like, what happened? Like this, we got to be able to do better than this. And help me to know what my specific role is. Let's get to know each other if we're not already in that relationship. And so, so that's what I want to share about today. They're good questions. I want to turn attention momentarily to those. I will say that there's a course, the Ancestral Lineage Healing online course, coming up. It starts this week, I think, or next week. And the details will be in the chat. And it stays open, I think, until January 18th. But I'll say just a couple things about it and then turn to the questions. It's a 14-week course. It follows the same material in the book, which I've written about this work. Ancestral Medicine is the name of the book. And it's well-resourced by supporters who have trained in ancestral healing work from around the world. And there's BIPOC and LGBTQ only calls for people of different ancestries and gender identities, sexual orientations, who want that especially welcoming, safe space to sink into this kind of work, which is already tender by nature and like doubly challenging to learn from a straightish white guy, and so the course is well resourced. There's a lot of live calls for interaction. There's pre-recorded lessons and options around cost reduction to keep everything accessible if you want to join us. So let me say just that much about the course, because I don't want to get too salesy, so to speak. Okay, somebody asked, Jeremy, can other than humans be considered our ancestors? Do some people have greater affinities to certain other than humans because of their ancestral lineages? For sure, on the second one. It's part of what we actually cover in the course, in one of the earlier lessons, is what are the spirits, deities, etc. of affinity that we're connected to through our lineages, that we inherit affinities to certain elemental, plant, animal, etc. powers just by virtue of being born into the family we're born into. So that's definitely true. And yeah, the other than humans certainly can be considered our ancestors as well. And that very expanded understanding of kinship is very welcome in the course. It's certainly a perspective that I'm working from generally. And it's important that we also include ancestors in our sense of, that we also include humans in our sense of ancestry. Because for most people, humans are kind of the most scary and dangerous animal and thing to relate with in the whole universe, which makes good sense to me. And so the invitation is to also include some contact with real kindness and wisdom and expansive goodness in human form in the context of your own lineages, so that you know that that goodness also lives within you. that's to temper the risk of kind of bypassing that important work and going only to the I'm a child of the rivers and stars, which is true. It's just incomplete. You're also a child of some humans who are a lot of times actually really nice people. So both and. Yeah, good question, Jeremy. I am scanning a bit the questions to see what jumps out here. And we do talk about, I see a question from Brooke. Do I have guidance for people who are trying to do this work? Like you have an altar, you have guided meditation from the books, but struggling to perceive something like a response. Yeah, we do talk about that a good amount, especially toward the front of the course, is how, what if it's not working? What if it's not getting anything? I'm not getting anything. There's an assumption in the course that it's possible as a participant to relate directly with your own ancestors. That's the intent, is to help you, if you're not already there, to cultivate that direct pathway of guidance and support and connection, or to cultivate it more strongly if it's already there a bit, and to feel empowered in that. Like none of our team wants to like in any way get in between you and your people. It's just about like tech support really on that. That said, the practitioners, there are 67 people, I believe, as of today, in the Ancestral Medicine Practitioner Training Network. Those are folks I've trained to guide session work. And so not all, but many of them also offer low-income sessions. And there are folks with lots of different skill sets and backgrounds and geographies, ancestries, etc. And so connecting with one of them, even if just for a couple sessions, can be really supportive if there's a stuckness. And of course, there's an opportunity to share about that in the course, in the Q&A space. People can ask questions of me at any time in the course. I respond to all those. And there are, as I mentioned, a couple breakout calls each week, and also small group space during the course. So bringing the challenge into group space can be really nice, because it's not like you're just trying to connect. You're also trying to disrupt generations, typically, of internalized colonialist cultural damage that says, if you talk to dead people, shame on you. That's a less educated thing to do. That's a superstitious, irrational thing to do. And so when at some point we've internalized that harshness and, bigoted kind of judgment in our lineages, it can take a little bit to actually break through that conditioning. It's totally possible. But so just getting a little support is great. And there's a lot of resource for that in the course and everything. Somebody says, I'm glad for the class so I could learn to grieve without blowing out my nervous system by having the ancestors support me. The question then is it appropriate to feel grief for strangers? And I've been needing to do some practices around that. No, I don't think it's inappropriate at all. We're empathic creatures, strangers, I know what you mean by it, but I think you mean by that people who you haven't met yet and you may never meet directly, but somehow they come into your awareness through the web, whether it's through the news, and I don't mean the internet web, I mean like the web of relatedness, through the news or through somebody whatever it is. And suddenly there's something about their energy and your energy or their condition where you're empathically, you're just touched by it. Somebody sent me a poem the other day. I was just hanging out early in the morning with her daughter in the kitchen making pancakes and looking at this poem on the phone, and I started crying, and I'm like, struck by this Turkish, forget his name now, poet who's passed, but the poem is very profound and cracked me open a bit. And is he a stranger? I don't know. That doesn't feel that way to me. It feels like if I met him, I would not even need to say much. So I think part of what we're doing is being asked to melt the category of stranger a little. And you guys stay regulated a bit and make sure it's not only your own personal ungrieved grief. Sure, both. Somebody asks, how do I feel the ancestors have helped me? So many ways, really. For me, one of the biggest, like I had, not an abusive, but I had a lonely childhood. And it drove me to, and I was surrounded by good people. I just felt alone in it. And it drove me to see I wasn't conscious of it, but to see the creek I played in and the woods and the animals, especially as kin. And my own, I had a strong imagination world. And so it's like I implicitly learned that I could relate with others, even though I didn't get a framework for it until I was in my late teens. And I'm like, oh, this makes total sense. Thank goodness other people have discovered this. And so it set me on a path of trying to belong and feel at home in the world. And so one of the distinct blessings, for me at least, that my ancestors have brought into my life is they're like, we see you. Even if you feel in any given moment like people around you don't see you, we see you very accurately. Of course, they don't say it that way. It's kind of not very poetic. But they do. Like, I feel known by them. And that matters a lot. That, like, draws me out of the tendency to be this, like, living in another world. Beyond that, I have a lovely family. And so the children, their ancestors returning. So that's good. They've helped my relationships with my living family to be as good as they can be, which are fortunately pretty good. They have set me on a path that happens to include supporting other people with ancestral reconnection, which is really nourishing and endlessly surprising, and comes with different challenges, of course. But so they've brought meaningful work into my life. But there's a sense of never being alone, and just really, I love it here. I love it on Earth. It's just a giant pain in the ass, but it's I feel in touch with a really deep, old, Earth-focused, Earth-specific human love, and so they've been teachers for me about humanity and kindness. And when challenging things happen in my life, there's a way in which their collective wisdom is like, yeah, you're not the first one to, like, have somebody swing at you or, like, have a thing happen. Let us hold you. That's hard. And so they are good teachers about kindness and patience. Help me to be a good dad and husband and teacher and all that. So those are a few things, but it's ongoing, Great. I am seeing if there are other questions that came through. I see a few here. About collective grieving, there are pockets of folks sensing and welcoming this, and also large forces actively blocking it. Any thoughts or reasons for these obstacles and how to soften these barriers? So, well, it depends how esoteric you want to be about it. Are there forces that are not necessarily human, that are not rooted in love and kindness and relationality, that are, let's say, predatory, exploitative? Yeah, there are those ones. They're part of the larger ecology of what is. Sometimes that quality or that spectrum of energy gets played out through humans. Sometimes it's spirits or things like that directly. And do they benefit from things staying stuck? Sure. It doesn't tend to be my approach. Remember, I'm in a role as a ritualist of teaching to a lot of people, not all of whom I'm going to meet directly because of the online format and all that. There's a lot of ways to engage with people I've trained, and we care as a team, and we're responsive, and I'm not like one-on-one back and forth mentoring each person I come in touch with. So it means I need to account for ritual safety in what I'm teaching and how I'm presenting it. Therefore, mostly the approach is to connect with what is deeply life-affirming and beautiful and alive and dynamic within your own lineages, and just strongly build on that, and not give a ton of focus to all the different hazards or types of interference or what isn't working or what could go wrong and all that. So you want to, it's a ritually sensible strategy to strongly build on the positive, not naively, but as strategy. There's always ways to avoid the challenging work of becoming a grown-up. And if you come into direct conversation with your people and you let them guide you, they'll steer you through that. It becomes not, what does it mean? How do I understand it? But it's more like, what do I need to know? Just tell me what I need to know. I'm done trying to control the universe by figuring it out. What do I need to know today? Show me that. So that's kind of the approach. Good. I see a question from Caitlin. How do I work with an ancestor who's deeply sad themselves? How do you support them in their grief for their life on Earth? Yeah, great question. There's a very, very important distinction in relating with the human dead in spirit, which is a distinction, and it's not so cut and dry, but also it kind of is, between the ancestors and the ghosts, the not yet ancestors, the troubled dead, the ones who are still between here and there, something like that. And the way I encourage people to think about it, if they can stand to do it, I mean, I'm a bit Germanic by my own ancestry, is a 1 to 10 scale. So the higher, the better. So in that scale, the 1 to 7 are the something other than, or 1 to 6 are the something other than ancestors. It might be the really troubled ones in that 1 to 3 range. You could think of the living in this way too. You've probably met some folks like that. Hopefully you're not rolling in the 1 to 3 range these days. And then 4 to 6 is like, not deeply awake, but will do the right thing most of the time and kind of having your life and mixed, you know. And then 7 to 10 is like, oh, this feels safe and good. This would be a fine energy to have around the kids. Or like 8, 9, 10 is like, wow, this is beautiful. It's like ancestral teachers and wisdom beings. And so in this process, knowing that the dead change, we start out the process by seeking contact with those who are in the really decisively healed and well category. And we ask them to bring healing throughout the steps of the process to those who are not quite there yet, so that everybody in our lineages can be in that really vibrant, healed condition, however that looks like for your people. So if you were to say there's an ancestor who's still in their own grief and sorrow, my response would be, without knowing more, and with affirming that grieving and sorrow is very sacred and not to be judged, it's probably an indicator that they're in their own healing process, and we wouldn't relate with them as an ancestral guide, but as someone in process of becoming an ancestor. And so that distinction is important here. And I see just a few other questions, and we'll finish soon here. From Sami. Says, I'm a death and grief doula, starting to work with young adults who are grieving the loss of folks from COVID. Any specific ways to call in support from the ancestors while honoring the ancestors of the people I'm working with? Well, if you don't have a habit of doing it otherwise, and you're going to begin to call on your ancestors directly, I wouldn't jump to doing it professionally on behalf of others. But you might already have a habit of it. So I wouldn't start there if you haven't already started. If you have, or either way, one distinction is to say, I call on the wise and kind and healed ones of my people who wish to support me in this moment. So make it more narrow than just calling on all of your ancestors, because it's a mixed bag. It's kind of like I call on all the humans within 10 miles to come to my party. Yeah, don't do that. And so so be discerning about it. And then once they're there, let's say some of your wise, kind, elder people show up, you just ask them to love well the person that you're supporting. And that might look like some of that one's older, wise ancestors stepping forward. Most people aren't going to want to talk about that or have a framework for that. And it kind of gets into how much are you guiding ritual with that person. Because it can get a lot of things can happen there. So I wouldn't get way into the thick of it. But if you have a relationship over time with your people, and you are clear that you're calling on those who really are able and willing to help you with that, once they're present, just let your prayer, whether or not it's spoken out loud, for the person you're supporting, be amplified by your ancestors, by their guidance, and just love that person really well, because people are not hurting for advice. Most people have a shortage of just empathy and patience and kindness in their life. Good. Okay, let's do these last three questions and we'll weave out. If somebody wants to know and understand their destiny, would asking the well and wise ancestors be the most constructive route? I don't want to say, there are many ways to go about a thing and to arrive at clarity. So I don't want to say it's the best way, but it's the way that I recommend to folks as a kind of default way to seek clarity. If someone asks, well, who do I ask? That's who I would start with. I would also say, who are the people who really know you best and who you trust the most, the living people, and ask them to kindly tell you what they see about your potential and what they see in you. That's it's vulnerable, but that's a good bit of information as well. But I do think it's important to ask the ancestors about it. That's been my habit, and I've gotten good results from that and from seeing other people do that. But it's not the only way, just one good one. Somebody asked, wondering how the idea of oneness or the idea that nothing exists outside ourselves fits into things. Well, yeah. I mean, it's a fine question. There's a lot I could say about it. If you want to embody a kind of oneness or non-dual stance, it's important to know that horror, real violence and abuse lives within you, and to know that the confusion and trauma of the world lives within you, and hatred, real meanness, cold hatred lives within you. Most people really don't want to take it there. And so when we say it's all one, I mean the good stuff, what we're really saying is I participate in dividing the world in half by judging and rejecting and alienating the suffering of the world and setting it free to roam independent of me. I'm not saying you're doing that. I mean, it's a fine question, but the oneness, if we want to take it to heart, is a tough, beautiful but tough orientation to life to live into, to lean into. Yes, our ancestors are part of the extended community of what is, just like the gods and the spirits and the land spirits and all the other powers that aren't even of the earth. They're part of the larger coherence. And they certainly lived into very awake states during their life and after, and can support us in knowing how that looks in the context of our own cultures and backgrounds and all that. So I'm not disagreeing that in one sense there's nothing totally foreign to us. I'm just saying that it's a weighty kind of understanding to try to embody. But yes, they can assist with that, for sure, because they expand our sense of humanity. Last two questions, I think. Any advice on going through the grieving process with an ancestor who was once abusive but seeks healing? Yeah, there's a lot about that too, but mostly you want to make sure that they are in fact deeply well and healed in spirit, and that you're having the even elder to you and that one ancestors oversee the process there, so it doesn't get too messy. Like that, you need a mediator for that. Is it possible for deep grieving and forgiveness from harms that were enacted to occur? Absolutely. It's important. And it doesn't, it's not automatically safe, and it's not automatically easy. So there needs to be a larger sort of matrix or container or web of wellness or holding for that to go well usually. But it can. And the dead can change just like we can change. And all the really good talk about restorative, transformative justice rather than punitive models, all the really important talk about abolition in the very concrete sense of dismantling prisons and all the racist legacies that go with that, and the emotional, relational, communal, and even spiritual implications of that, is moving out of a model of punishment and into what needs to happen for repair and healing here. And that it absolutely includes the dead and how we relate with the dead. You can be like, well, this person made some real bad choices. They're in ghosty forever jail. And I'm like really down for abolition in my waking hours. Yeah, well, but you're not, because there's a disconnect. You're holding people in your heart space in the penalty box of perpetual damnation and punishment, while espousing these liberatory values that are not actually very embodied. So it's scary and vulnerable and sacred to seek forgiveness for the harms that have occurred before our birth and the ways that they reverberate through these bodies. It doesn't mean anybody's off the hook. To the contrary, that's how we actually stay on the hook, is to stay in relationship. It's easy to just be, I don't say it's easy, but it's straightforward to live in a black and white world. You just punish the bad people because they're never you. No problem. Yeah, I got some feelings about that. Last question. There's a lot of people in spiritual communities aligned with conspiracy theories. I'm grieving this rift in our culture. Daniel, can I speak to this? Yeah, I can try to say a final thing about that. I tend to also, the word conspiracy theory lands for me just fine. I think it's a non-starter in terms of actually bridging with folks who are holding those less common, less substantiated views. I have been dismayed but I don't know if it's that surprised, but just bummed out to see how many folks in so-called spiritual circles are have anti-science views around the pandemic, for example. And to me, it looks very ableist, very avoidant of the legacies of inequality that are exacerbated by the pandemic. And I don't know, there's a lot of hurt. There's a lot of unaddressed emotional hurt. And the culture and the belonging that's offered by the dominant culture, at least in the United States, is not a very appealing kind of belonging. And so when people feel hurt and not very trusting for really understandable reasons, and someone in a position of authority is like, oh, this is what's happening, or this, watch out for this virus. I know you can't see it. It's real small, folks. You can't see it with your eyeballs. And watch out for it all the same. Be like, I don't believe that, or whatever. And so it's understandable, psychologically speaking, but the way I see it is like, we'll do anything to belong. And if belonging means identifying with others who feel a kind of identity, shared identity and cleverness by identifying with the opposite of the mainstream thing, well then, people will take it, even if it costs them their lives. So, you know, wear your masks, get the vaccine if it's available to you. Don't skip in line. Like, let's get through the pandemic. It's really deadly and hard on a lot of people. And beyond that, like, let's do better in this country in terms of the real troubling histories. It's been a hard 4 years for people here, and for anybody outside looking in on the U.S. If it looks bad, it's that. It's not like it's new exactly, but the last 4 years have been really like dystopian, super fucking downer hard for a lot of people. And so it's probably worse than it looks from the outside. And so hoping for a rally on that, and not holding my breath too much, but you know, here we are. Geez, way to ask that question at the end. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Let me say about the course that we actually have a good time with the learning. I'm committed as a teacher to meeting people well. Like, I care in that like engaged professor-y kind of way, even though I'm a ritualist. But our team is, it's not our first time running this course, and we're committed to doing a good job with it. And we have probably 30, I don't know how many, at least 30 probably, trained ritualist supporters. And they're great. They do a great job. And I forgot to mention that we have also a weekly call in Australia-friendly time zone to make sure people on the other side of the earth are well met and not having to get up at odd hours to join. So we care about the international inclusivity. Yes, I'm a U.S. citizen, but the approach is international in spirit. And in that regard, just a happy note that the book is now available not only in Chinese and Croatian, but also Dutch and soon to be Polish, which is nice. And yeah, this talk will be available for replay soon. All the details on the course are at ancestralmedicine.org, and I appreciate you all. If you want to see how it's been for other people, there's also testimonials and such on the site. But you can sign up. Last thing is, you can sign up and be like, yeah, I don't know if I want to do this, but let me try it. You can sign up, and then if you're like, I don't like it, we also offer a money back thing for the first month. So yeah, thanks everybody. Be good to yourselves, and hope you might join us, and have a good rest of your day. Take care.